So, of course, we're all keenly aware that just a few weeks ago, the Supreme Court struck down Roe v. Wade and the right to an abortion. The consequences of that decision to the reproductive health of millions of people across the country was immediate and devastating, and its impact is still being understood by many of you who fight in our reproductive justice movement. And yet, the destruction of reproductive rights wasn't the only indication that a political agenda, decidedly authoritarian, religious, and nationalistic in nature, was being implemented through our country's highest court, and with impunity. To help us understand the impact, threat, and trajectory of this authoritarian policymaking from the bench, I'm joined today by two comrades who truly understand what it means to talk, strategize, and lawyer in partnership with organizers and grassroots movements, Vince Warren and Marbre Stahly-Butts. Vince is the executive director of Center for Constitutional Rights and a leading expert on racial injustice and discriminatory policing. He oversees CCR's groundbreaking litigation and advocacy work, using international and domestic law to challenge human rights abuses, including racial, gender, and LGBTQIA injustice. Marbre is the executive director of Law for Black Lives. She works closely with organizers and communities across the country to advance and actualize radical policy, and she serves on the leadership team of the Movement for Black Lives policy table and helped develop the Vision for Black Lives policy platform. She also just came back from hosting an incredible gathering in St. Louis, Lawyering for Liberation, which I missed out on, unfortunately, where lawyers, legal workers, and organizers strategized about how movement lawyers can support radical movement in this critical moment. Vincent Marbre, I'm so glad you're here with us today to put this moment in meaningful context. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. Vince, let's start with you, and let's start by assessing some of the damage in a historical context. As I mentioned, abortion rights were overturned in Dobbs, and that alone represents a seismic upending of established law. But we also saw separation of church and state undermined in Kennedy, a school prayer case, and in Carson, a private religious school funding case. The court struck down an open carry law in New York, where you're located, that has implications for state gun regulations across the country in the midst of a mass shooting epidemic. In the Vega case, we saw protections against self-incrimination and police custody eviscerated in a moment when there are increasingly calls for greater police accountability and police abolition has entered our public lexicon. We saw tribal sovereignty overridden in the Oklahoma case, and in West Virginia, we saw the EPA's power to regulate pollution seriously undermined at a time when climate crisis is threatening all species, especially ours. So each of these rollbacks obviously deserves its own treatment, and I'm not going to ask you to do that, thankfully. But taking the decisions of this past term in the aggregate, what damage has been done to the integrity and durability of constitutional rights, on one hand, and on the other to constitutional law and the legal doctrines that should be guardrails against an extremist bench like stare decisis? For those who don't know the legalese, a court doctrine that advises courts to avoid overturning settled law like Roe, or for separation of church and state. Are these concepts, are these rights, have they suddenly become meaningless under this court?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here with my sister Marbre as well. And it's wonderful to be with you all. And I mean, Thomas, to answer your question, honestly, it's the same impact that happens when a tornado goes through your community, or if you were in Louisiana during Katrina and Rita, that you look at what's left, and sometimes it's hard to imagine what used to be there before. It's hard to imagine what you were building, the impacts not only on your particular house and the way that you live, but on your community are tremendous. And the challenge, amongst the many challenges that we have, is now we have a wholly ideological, unaccountable Supreme Court with tremendous power and influence to rewrite the agreements that we have been trying to make about how the state treats us, particularly as Black, brown, BIPOC people, to that rewrite the agreements and aspirations of how the state should act to protect us rather than to criminalize us. And it all comes together in this particular term. And so I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Let me say this: it's great to be with you from the Center for Constitutional Rights, and we actually been around for a minute, and we don't, even as lawyers, don't at all believe that our collective liberation comes out of a decision from any court, much less the Supreme Court. However, it's so notable what's happening now. I think it's really worth talking about, and particularly from an organizing strategy, because lawyers ain't gonna save us, and neither are the politicians. But it's around how we organize people to lift up the demands of what living in our society should feel like and should be for us. And perhaps working with lawyers and other folks to maintain some of those gains. And what we're seeing now is the gains that have been made up to this point are now being eradicated. There are a couple of points that I think are worth bringing up. I'm not going to talk about all of the cases that you mentioned. They're all, disastrous. But the Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health, which was the 6-3 decision in which the Supreme Court overruled Roe versus Wade, limiting the constitutional right to abortion after almost 50 years. That decision, I think the impact, as negative as it is on the idea of our right to be able to access the healthcare that we need and that we deserve without the state telling us under which circumstances and how many weeks and so forth. It's devastating. It is horrible, and it will impact all of us, and particularly, I think, non-urban communities, communities in the South, communities in the Midwest, where organizers and advocates are going to have to scramble to keep their people safe. And very much like fugitive slave laws that were passed in the 1800s, we can and should expect that not only is has the right to abortion been eliminated for many people, also the criminalization of those that seek sexual, reproductive, or other types of healthcare, frankly, can and will be criminalized. And so it will be a situation, we're getting calls right now from folks on the ground because organizers are, and probably everybody on this and the webinar is really activated around this. Can we do this? Can we do that? Where can we get safe services? How can we keep from being criminalized? Those are the impacts that are happening. And I don't use the slavery analogy lightly, nor do I use references to Native American criminalization laws around keeping indigenous folks in one particular location, not of their choosing, is that this is the way power operates when met with a demand by particularly Black and people of color, which is that it's a social control mechanism that ultimately, no matter what it says in the front, in the back, it is always accompanied by criminalization. And so for those of us that are in that work, we need to be prepared for how to keep our people safe, not just in terms of being able to access what they're doing, but also what they need rather, but also to be able to do so without being criminalized and thrown in jail. I think that's really one of the big questions moving forward in that space. Another case that I think is really significant, which I think raises a slightly different question, is West Virginia versus Environmental Protection Agency, and that's the case in which the Supreme Court ruled that the Clean Air Act did not allow the EPA to issue broad regulations around climate change and so forth. And the stupid little rule, this has been a battle that's been going on for a long time between conservatives and less than conservative courts, which has been to what power does an administrative agency, that's an agency that's in the executive branch that issues policies that can keep us safe, to what extent do they actually have the power to do it? And this is really a long-standing, and we find it a lot in the last several years in terms of the American right, that they essentially see the administrative state, as they call it, things like the EPA, things like the Department of Justice, things like different types of agencies as exceeding the power that Congress has granted them to be able to do the things that they want to do. And the reason why I think it's important to raise this is because this court has already signaled, as has the right wing, that this analysis is going to go beyond the EPA and environmental policy. There are also signals that the court has already expressed real skepticism towards the reach of other agencies, including during the coronavirus pandemic. Has ruled that the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention wasn't authorized to issue a moratorium on evictions that many of us and many people on this call probably fought for. That the federal agency has no ability to accede to the demands that we're making. That's essentially what the court is saying. Also, even with things like telling large employers that they need to have their workers vaccinated or undergo frequent testing, the court said that they couldn't do. And I think what this portends, it's a particular challenge for us, I think, on the left, because on the one hand, many of us are not in love with relying on the state apparatus to keep us safe. That's not the way to go. We don't want to bureaucratize our freedom and our liberation. We don't want it to be subject to the vagaries and the election cycles that it has been. So we're in kind of an interesting space. On the one hand, where the federal government can potentially do something good, and I would argue not good enough, but something good, like really issues federal policy with respect to climate change, where a lot of us are pushing for that. And the Supreme Court is saying, we don't think they have the power unless Congress specifically tells them they can do the things that the president is asking them to do. And on the other hand, we've come through in our history pretty clearly situations where federal agencies have not only overstepped their authority and nobody cared about it, but have actually acted to criminalize, to demonize, and to curtail us, and to do the opposite of freedom. So it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, we might at some point have been arguing that the FBI doesn't have the authority to be able to do something like COINTELPRO, and the decision might look like something like this in a situation where we're advocating for a reduction of federal authority. On the other hand, when there's a situation like this where some of us might agree that Congress should be doing more, the agency should be doing more, the Supreme Court is saying, no, you can't do that. The last case that I want to just mention is the case that you were talking about, Thomas, the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin. And this is a case in which the Supreme Court struck down a New York law that placed restrictions on carrying guns outside of the home. Two things on this. One is that the gravamen, or the idea behind this case, the Supreme Court was saying, hey, the federal government, it's a constitutional right. The states should not be deciding who can carry what at what point. Because it's a federal constitutional right, we're going to say the states have no power to be able to put those types of restrictions on them. But if you contrast that with the Dobbs decision, the abortion decision, the Supreme Court is saying the exact opposite. They're saying that there is no constitutional right, and the states can do pretty much whatever they want to control our behavior. And so even though they're two separate doctrines in the Supreme Court context, I think this actually puts in very stark relief the challenge for organizers, much less lawyers, which is that we have an unaccountable Supreme Court that, because it's ideologically driven, is changing the rules about what the federal government can do and what the state's governments must and can do. And they're doing it in such a way that we lose federally and we lose on the state level. And the other thing that I wanted to say about the Second Amendment issue, and I'm just raising this because, Thomas, you were talking about sort of historical pieces. Second Amendment, although the Supreme Court just made up, they just made up the Second Amendment analysis. You do not have the right just to roll around, carrying guns like it's Westworld. You don't, and the states can and should put limits on those things. However, it's important to recognize that in the early days, and particularly after many of us were freed from enslavement, these the state courts were actually using gun control laws to keep guns and other things out of the hands of freed slaves and free people, and also indigenous folks. So that the double-edged sword here is that while some of us might say now that the states need to do something about all these crazy guns, the states were doing something about us 100 years ago and saying that we didn't have access to these things. So I'm only raising that I really to point out the contradictions more than a pathway to the future. And I think that with folks on this call and people that are doing this kind of work that can really lean into a nuanced way of thinking about this work in terms of leading and organizing people, can do so in ways that I think clearly tell us that, again, our salvation doesn't come from courts or from presidential administrations deciding what's good for us. Our salvation and our liberation comes from our ability to meaningfully influence those types of policies, and meaningfully and demanding that courts and legislatures are deciding and legislating in ways that make us more free, that make us more safe, that allow us to thrive in the way that many of us have never been allowed to thrive in this country.
Thanks, Vince. I think it's the double edging of the swords, of the numerous swords here, is quite a predicament to figure out, and it's well taken that it requires a nuanced approach on an organizing and a movement lawyering scale level. But and part of that is because there's no nuance on the other side. Marbre, I want to kind of talk a little bit about that, and also maybe put into context a little bit of this idea of the courts not being a place of salvation for movements. Since Dobbs was announced, many reproductive justice rights, workers and movement workers have said, we will aid and abet an abortion, and that's been a rallying cry for several people in the reproductive justice movement, who recognize that while the Dobbs decision might ostensibly carry the force of law, it lacks legitimacy, and that crisis of legitimacy for the court is happening within a larger crisis of legitimacy for capital across the U.S. and the globe, as it's failing to resolve multiple crises: climate change, pandemic, the increased precarity of living for working people and poor people everywhere. So in the context of these dire political conditions, and with so much at stake for our lives and our futures, should we treat the U.S. Supreme Court, overrun with authoritarian ideologues that want to take us back to the 1800s, as an illegitimate institution? What are the strategic implications for organizing and for lawyering when the court's legitimacy is in question to this degree, and with no obvious end in sight?
Well, first of all, thank you so much. We are fans at LPL of the Center for Political Education generally, and have appreciated all of the great insights and support you've given us and our members, and of course fans of CCR and AP and other folks. So just really honored to be here and to be having this conversation. I think it's a really important question. One thing that I think it's important to ground ourselves in is that this crisis of legitimacy, although I think acute at this moment, is by no ways new. And so my answer, I guess, for the preview is absolutely, we should treat this court as illegitimate, but not only for the reasons that I think are kind of surfacing in this moment of, for instance, 5 of the justices of the 9 have been appointed by presidents who didn't win the popular vote. That's a very kind of common quote. We're also seeing a real kind of overstepping of judicial power that we've seen in the past, but I think is really at its kind of extreme in moments like now, and of course pre-Civil War and the Lochner era. But I think there's also deep and profound structural reasons why this court, and not just this court and who's on it, but the court generally is in many ways an illegitimate institution. And I think a lot about kind of Du Boisian abolition democracy. And if you think about what actually makes up the court, so the president, who's elected by electoral college, appoints, selects a nominee, and then of course the Senate, which is the least democratic body in the land, then conforms that appointee. And so really the Supreme Court is one of the least democratic institutions inside of an already elitist democracy. that has always been about upholding the power and legitimacy of the rich, of capital, of men, of patriarchy, of anti-Blackness. These are not new things. And I think often because we had the Warren Court and a very brief period of somewhat liberal progressive policies coming out of the Supreme Court, we think of the Supreme Court as a guardian of civil and liberal and political rights. The reality is, if you look at the long history of the court, whether you start with kind of the pre-Civil War era and the Dred Scott decision, the aggressive anti-Blackness and anti-Indigenousness and anti-womanness of the court, then whether you take a kind of post-Reconstruction where Lincoln actually passed the court because the court is so anti-Black and so pro-slavery that he can't pass or move any legislation. Then looking at kind of the Reconstruction era, where again, the court is striking down every single federal piece of legislation that's trying to expand the rights of free people, of recently freed people, to the Lochner era, where you see the court striking down every single union, worker protection. The court has never been a friend of Black people, brown people, poor people, Indigenous people, working class people. And every time we've seen decisions from the court that protect even basic rights, it's been because of massive social pressure and movement. And so I think it's important to ground this moment in that this is not the first time, and it will not be the last time if we continue with these kinds of institutions where you have a court that is aggressively going after the rights and liberties of people who are marginalized and oppressed. So that is not by any ways new. And the court has never been accountable. I think in the past, when you think about kind of Roberts and his political persuasions, we've had judges who were more concerned about the mantle and the kind of public opinion of legitimacy of the court. But the reality is the court is unelected, rich, white, mostly men, mostly white, people who are richer than and have more privileges than most people in this country, and hasn't been really deeply concerned with our liberties. I think that's important to name because, in fact, there's nothing about the court that holds it accountable to anybody. The accountability has been a personal decision of the justices, but that actually is not an institutional or structural solution to what we face. And so I would argue not only that this court is illegitimate, I think that the packing of this court with judges from the Federalist Society who have a very clear political agenda has made it really clear, like the emperor has no clothes on, that in fact this institution is not sustainable and never has served people. But I think there has been a long-standing fallacy in kind of liberal, maybe even progressive circles, that the court is in fact here to be a guardian. The court was created as a way to actually block democratic movement in basic ways. It was always meant to be elite judges make decisions about people's lives. And so I think it's just really important that we take seriously the lessons of history that over and over again we've seen the court betray the working class, the poor, the Black, the brown, and other folks who most need protection. So to Vince's point, I think that it's really important that as lawyers, as legal workers, we take seriously our job of mitigating the harm and the criminalization that this court is going to bring on, but also that we do not get, I think, caught up in defending the legitimacy of the court, even when it's been convenient and helpful in some ways. The Warren era, it never actually was meant to serve us or our interests. And so I think the counter-organizing and us being really clear about the illegitimacy is actually really important in this moment. So I think even thinking through the indication and implication of other institutions like the Senate, like the Electoral College, understanding the court as part of the elite buttressing and the elite protection of the power of the elite to keep capital, to keep control over other people's bodies, especially the bodies of women, of queer folks, of Indigenous folks. Us understanding that this is actually the tradition and the purpose of this court, I think helps us in this moment have a more comprehensive analysis that, as the chant goes, the whole system is rotten, right? That it really is. This is, I think, a symptom of a rotten system, and one of a acute moment where kind of everyone can see that. And so I think it's an invitation to radicalize folks around the illegitimacy of the court. But it is not new. The court is not illegitimate because of who's on it. It's actually the structure of the Supreme Court that's backed by a Senate and Electoral College, which are undemocratic, that I think make it illegitimate in some basic ways. What I also just want to name and mention that I think is important, and I think for me the implication of illegitimacy is that actually the court doesn't have enforcement power. And I think as states and as folks, we have to think about what that means. Of course it does if people don't choose to resist it. But in theory, the whole idea was to have a branch of government that, although could make some decisions, was not actually given the power to enforce those decisions. And so what would it mean? What does it look like for us to, to resist decisions coming out of the court? I think it's a really important question. And what organizing do we need to see in states to make that real and possible? And what kind of economies of chaos do we have to see throughout states that in fact would not resist, right? And so I think there's some real organizing questions we have to take seriously, but I do think it's important that we think about this moment of the court as a moment to actually talk about the illegitimacy, not just of these systems, but I think in the words of Du Bois, what are all of the systems that must be abolished for us to actually live as free people in this country? And I think the Supreme Court, as it stands now, is one of those.
Thanks, Marbre. I think that that historical grounding you gave us is absolutely essential to understanding this moment. And I'm curious, a quick follow-up to both of you, since you were both at the movement, the Lawyering for Liberation conference. What does movement lawyering offer us something here in terms of understanding this? And I say that because I do think there's going to be some hand-wringing from the legal field in terms of like the traditional lawyering model about like what can be done. And one thing that's important in moments like this is obviously guarding against the hopelessness or despair that sometimes comes, even if it's warranted and even if it's justified, right? On some level, I think that particularly in the legal field, and particularly for organizers who look to lawyers for some of that guidance, right? In terms of like, what does the playing field look like in the legal landscape? For both of you, is movement lawyering instructive here? Is there something that's worthwhile taking out of the conversations maybe you had at the conference that would be worth sharing with folks today?
Yeah, I think so. And I think, I want to plus one what Marbre was talking about, because I think that's actually the instructive piece around movement lawyering, which is that we have been operating as lawyers and we have been subject to, as people, an illegitimate system from the perspective of that it pretends to be designed to decide things fairly, to decide things democratically, and so on. There are a couple of pieces to this. One is, I think the movement lawyering piece, I think organizers should be getting down with lawyers that share their skepticism of illegitimate power and share their skepticism of the way that state power operates or says that it operates fairly, and at the same time also get down with lawyers that understand how organizers are trying to move through this moment, because you can only move through this moment and win if you're leveraging power in some way. And I think, where just about the hand-wringing from the lawyers, the problem with the lawyers is that they're going to be trying to leverage their power. Sorry, they're going to be trying to leverage legal power. And we've already said, like, if you go back far enough, this stuff isn't working. Maybe 50 years from now, guess what? Look at that. Roe versus Wade is now back on. I promise you that nobody will be making any different arguments then than they were making now than they made 50 years ago. The things that will have changed is that the human beings on the court and the political moment that has been really designed by the organizers will have changed. So I think getting down with folks to be able to strategize, well, if we need to move power, what's the power that we want to leverage of the people? What are the impacts of successfully leveraging that power, which come up in terms of criminalization, the range of things, and then connecting on those particular pieces, I think are really key. And I think that the challenge that we have as movement lawyers, being that there are so many people and so many movements and so few lawyers, is that we can get caught up. We can get caught in the very legitimate question that Audre Lorde poses to us about the master's house and the master's tools. And I think that the better question is, what do organizers see as the power that needs to be moved and built at this point? And then how can lawyers help support that power? And Marbre was talking beautifully about the question of resistance. And resistance of laws is something that we've always done, and we always will do. The question is around people that are building bases of power. And sometimes that power gets manifest in voting, right? That's a totally legitimate strategy. To rely on existing and continuing voting rights protections from the Supreme Court is a stupid exercise. No one on this call should be under the illusion that this is going to last for more than 15 minutes. But there is, in the base building context, there's a real opportunity to be able to work with lawyers so that the impediments that get thrown in the way of building power are something that can be addressed, as opposed to trying to find the big, I could write a brief and change the world type situation. That's going to work. So I think, coming from some of the conversations at the conference this week, a lot of us have been talking about how are we ready to throw down around the question of resistance, and not just the way that women are impacted by the Dobbs decision, and not just the way that these decisions are impacting particular classes of us or groups of us, but more along the lines of all of us in our ways need to be resisting in a lot of ways that might feel in the general mainstream political space. They will tell you that it is a bad solution to opt out or to resist or to push for abolition, because don't nobody want to hear that. But we need to, and we can, as lawyers, find ways to be able to partner so the very least we can strategize on what we think the obstacles might be and how you all might get around them.
Yeah, I would just amen, Vince. As usual, I think the two things that come to mind, one is, I think having the ability to be in a courtroom and to defend and support people at this moment is going to be an important contribution to movement. That, as Vince said, the state relies on criminalization to enforce many of these laws. We're seeing that across the country happening already. And so us being able to try to mitigate the harms of state violence against our people is going to be incredibly important. And it's not, as Vince said, we're not going to win on it, but it's going to give people more space. If you have a home you can live in, if you are not in a cage, these are ways that you actually can do the organizing work and join a movement and start to create more possibility and space. So I think the mitigation work will, I think, just become more important and more challenging. And I think it's essential that we as lawyers remember that the win actually doesn't happen in the courtroom, that it happens outside. But often for folks to be outside the courtroom, you have to do something in the courtroom. And so what does it mean for us to really harness and sharpen our tools around defense? I think, to Vince's point, us being really clear-eyed about the threats that we're seeing. And I think this is a question coming up, but every terrain, from voting rights to affirmative action, to environmental protections, to the economic system, and whether or not it can be regulated. All of these are up for grabs in the next few years. And so we should be really clear in our assessment for organizers when they ask, which they are also making, I think, in really effective ways, about what is going to be the terrain we're fighting on. And so I think that the power of assessment is also an important thing we can offer. And then I think what Vince said is once movements, and there will be lots of different movements, figuring out lots of different ways to resist and different ways to survive these moments. Once whatever movement you belong to or you need to become a part of figures it out, you get in your lane. What the skills you have, whether they're legal skills or artistic skills or writing skills or persuasive skills, or you know how to make that special cocktail that gets whatever it is. That you bring that to the table is really important, but you can't do that by yourself. And so often I think lawyers are solo actors. They think that this brilliance will strike them at their desk at 3 a.m. And in fact, the way we build power is when we do it together, when we figure out what our gifts, what we can contribute. The last thing I'll say, and this comes from the conference, and I'm thinking specifically of Nikita Oliver and Jaribu Hill, who were two of the speakers during the conference. I think it's really important, to Vince's point, that we think about resistance not just as a cute t-shirt or a nice tattoo if you're really committed, but actually what does that mean for your professional career, for your class position, for the work that you do. And I think Nikita at one point asked, what is worth your ball card? At what point are you willing to sacrifice and think through whether or not it's worth keeping this and what we give it up for? And I don't say that we ought to be burning ball cards or not following the quote-unquote ethical guidelines, but I think that it's a question of that. Resistance also means that you as a lawyer resist some things, and what are you willing to do and who are you in relationship with to do that? And I think Jaribu also pointed out this really important point about this not being new, and that if this feels like a surprise, if you feel shocked by this, if you feel hopeless by this, it is dire time. So the reality is that this has been coming, and if your tools are completely reliant on the court, it's time to rethink where you're drawing your power from. And so to Vince's point, you're right. If you think the only way that we protect rights or we win happens inside of courtrooms, then we are fucked, excuse my French. Like you should be hopeless. It's not gonna go well. But if you are in relationship with movement, it is still a really dire, scary moment, but there was a lot of hope because we have ridden the waves before of bad courts and bad laws and bad elected officials. And we're seeing globally both incredibly powerful movements of nationalism, of patriarchy, of authoritarianism. And we're also seeing movements of liberation and movements of mutual aid and collaboration. We're seeing socialism triumph in places. So I think it's important for us to be real about we are on the precipice of something, but will you believe power is derived from? Will you give your attention to plants that you water or the plants that will bloom? And so I think in this moment, us looking outside, using our tools to support movement, but us looking outside of those tools for salvation is really important. And that only happens through relationship. That can't happen through webinars or theorizing, or like it really happens when you are actually in relationship with folks who are doing organizing work. And it's a hard time for organizing work. So I think being part of those movements is really important.
Marbre, I truly appreciate. I mean, you were giving shout outs to CPE. Clearly, you've taken something from CPE's model because grounding us in history is absolutely essential in this moment. It's one of the more primary ways of avoiding, decontextualizing, the level of direness that we're facing, right? And connecting this to a longer historical struggle. Speaking of things that have been around for a while, white supremacy, authoritarianism, these are not new. Patriarchy is certainly ancient. And that's all of these things that are at play here. A lot of folks were watching the January 6th hearings last week. Maybe they were retweeting some Josh Hawley chicken memes or, something like that. It was comedy and scandal all at once, political theater. And it obviously paints a vivid picture of a dangerous attempt by the authoritarian movement to raid the Capitol and to overturn an election. And they failed there, right? But they did succeed in seizing control of the Supreme Court long before then as a movement. And so with this slate of decisions that came this term, with the historical context that you've given us, Marbre, and then seeing now this like political theater of the January 6th hearings, how do you make sense of the relationship between the tactics of authoritarian street violence on display on January 6th that we are seeing more frequently elsewhere, and a Supreme Court which acts as an instrument of an authoritarian policy agenda? What does it tell you about the kind of political force that we're up against and what's needed on our end to resist these distinct but potentially complementary tactics of authoritarianism?
I think that's me, so I'll start. Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really important point, and I think it's important to understand, as you said, these two things in concert. And again, to borrow from the page of history, this is also not new. If we think about the ways in which democracy in this country has been buttressed, and I say democracy in quotes, has been buttressed by white supremacist patriarchal violence, that is absolutely the history of this country. That you think about while the court was striking down Reconstruction legislation, literally the KKK was being founded to attack Black economic hubs throughout the country, to scale Black legislators into leaving the very buildings the court was saying they didn't have to be in anymore. And so there has been throughout, I think, American history and US history, a long, long history of vigilante white violence, often supported by police forces, often led by off-duty police officers and folks who are actually agents of the state, but nonetheless vigilante, supported by structures such as the courts, who either look the other way or create openings for that violence. The same, of course, is true of the Lochner era, where you see all of these cases striking down the rights of unions, the rights of working class people to have basic human rights. And at the same time, you see an influx of funds to policing by corporations to put down those strikes. And again, vigilante violence on the part of folks across the country to suppress not just workers, but specifically Black workers throughout the South and Midwest. And so again, I think grounding ourselves in as long as we adopt these institutions and try to save them, we're going to see the continuing patterns. And this pattern of kind of this inside-outside game where you have institutions creating space, creating literally impunity, whether it's through doctrines in the Supreme Court or through the lack of trying of people. And then, quite frankly, often doing show trials of doing one or two people get on trial. We make a big kind of case of it. We say we've done the right thing. Now we're legitimate again. That all of these are cycles of history that we've seen. I think it's important to name in this moment that, of course, the court and its decisions are literally empowering this sector of society. And so whether or not, and we'll talk a bit about this more, but we're going to see a number of decisions coming up next term that actually will give state legislators probably the right to make federal decisions about their elections. And when you think about the folks who were in DC about what's happening across the country, about this kind of big lie that's being told and validated, it literally plays into the hands of state legislators to make those decisions and to delegitimize and to discount democratic elections. And of course, yes to guns for white vigilantes, no to guns. I think it's important. We were on this call last week and we had a comma talk about somebody in Chicago, one of their members who was arrested because they had a bullet in their fanny pack and has been in jail for a year. And so we are also seeing, I think, not only the expansion of gun rights for some people, but as Vince said, it's not just 100 years ago where Black folks couldn't have guns. Now Black folks can't have guns because of a series of other ways in which Black folks are limited to have guns, like criminalization. And so, in fact, a very specific sector of people are getting the right to have semi-automatic military-grade weapons, while folks in Southside Chicago are arrested for over a year for having a single bullet in their fanny pack, right? And so we're really seeing, I think, this could open the door for a very specific group of people to have guns. We're seeing the complete and total taking away of the autonomy of people who have uteruses and the ability to control what happens to our bodies. This again is, this kind of patriarchal mob and this misogynistic nationalist sentiment again is reflected both in the streets, but also in the halls of the Supreme Court. And so I think it's important to name that not only is there kind of a conspiracy because Clarence Thomas's wife is down with it, but actually like there's a deeper and wider conspiracy we're seeing in terms of the conflation of interest and the willingness to really override any of the institutions, whether it is taking a mob to the Capitol or overriding the court in the way we've seen Mitch McConnell and others do and pack the court. That there was a real disregard for the very institutions that this part of, I think, the right have said was sacred in the past. And so I think it's important to name the hypocrisy. And I think what it contends for us as people on the left is, number one, that we should understand that this is a long-standing conspiracy that is not going to end, and that it is not, while it is not new, it is incredibly dangerous, and we should take it as such. And we should, I think, be ready to engage all the tools in our arsenal to fight it. So those are both our legal tools, but I think more importantly, our organizing tools and our other tools to think through if we actually have people coming, not just for all the laws to protect us, but literally for our bodies. We have a close partner in Buffalo who said, like, they'll at our grocery stores, right? That was a white supremacist attack at our grocery stores. Like, there's no place that was safe. What does that mean for how we create defense networks? What does that mean for how we keep ourselves safe? That I think our approach to this moment has to be a legal one, but it also has to be a self-defense one. That if you think about what was going on during Reconstruction and the lessons of our ancestors, they were planning not just for how to get folks elected or to have the vote, but also for how you protect your home and your family and your people in these moments when they are burning down our buildings and killing our grandmas at grocery stores. And so I think we should take seriously the violence that is both happening through our laws, but also through this vigilante violence, and recognize that it's meant to get us off guard. It's meant, I think, to have the impact of destabilizing our movements and making us act from fear. And so we should also be cognizant that that is part of the strategy.
Yeah, no, I think that's just sobering stuff, Marbre, and I really appreciate this concept of like a long conspiracy, right? They're part of the far right that we often hear in left circles is surprisingly they're really good at organizing, right, and strategizing, and there's a long-term strategy at play. And now they're pretty brazen about it. Vince, in the Dobbs decision, Clarence Thomas signaled what attacks might be ahead for the far right bench, mentioning Griswold and Lawrence and Obergefell, and more attacks on the right to privacy, same-sex marriage, maybe even legitimating anti-sodomy laws. Where do you think the authoritarian bench attacks next? What are the cases that you're paying close attention to in the coming term?
Yeah, if I could, can I
Yeah,
just
please.
vibe off of what Marbre laid down?
Absolutely.
Because I think there's a more there's another level that we can be having this conversation on, which I think is actually more conducive to how organizers and lawyers might work together. And I think one of the things that most people don't know is that our Constitution, the United States Constitution, covers mostly civil and political rights, and it doesn't cover social and economic rights. Most people don't know that. I think people just assume that. So if you think about the things that people are organizing for in their communities, housing, education, healthcare, a right to not be living in food deserts and all sorts of things like that. None of it is a constitutional right, none. And so the way that the legal framework works is it essentially protects civil and political rights for white folks, tells Black folks and women and queer folks and indigenous folks and immigrants, yeah, you have access to most of those same rights too, so therefore it's fair. But it protects political and civil rights for white folks, but it creates social and economic rights disasters for the rest of us. And so the reason why I wanted to raise that is that if you think about the West Virginia case, right? You asked what the Supreme Court's talking about. Well, the Clean Air Act doesn't give the authority to the EPA to issue these broad things like cap and trade and da da da. What that is the elites and the corporations saying we can't have this. And it gets framed in the context of civil and political rights and democracy, that Congress has to do this and has to do the hokey pokey, and if they didn't do it, then you don't get to do it. But what folks on the ground are fighting for are social and economic rights. And so essentially our social and economic rights gets translated in the Supreme Court lawyer machine into civil and political rights that make us think that this is a fair system, but we lose all the time on civil and political rights, and that creates social and economic rights disasters for us. So there is a reason why, when you look at the Supreme Court term this year, that carrying a gun is a right and controlling your reproductive health is not. And the reason why is that the tension between reproductive health and civil and political rights, which is the frame, is one that is very easily changed around by whichever authoritarian jerk is in power. But the civil and political rights never go away. And there's the social and economic rights never go away. And that's actually what we're fighting for. And so what I want to throw out, just for folks to think about, is what would it look like if lawyers align themselves with the way that communities and movements are thinking, which is around safety and security, and we translate them into rights. But we have to remember that rights these are the things that we have that the government can't mess with, which they mess with anyway. And we have a big fight over whether they can or whether they should. The government says that we didn't, and then what ends up happening is, for our social and economic rights, we shift those social and economic rights to administrative bodies. So it's not necessarily the court that's saying, you can't do this. We now have administrative bodies that are regulating the way that we breathe, whether we can keep our children where we live, whether we have whether we have access to our own houses on a federal level. So the shift might be, for us to think about together, is what would it look like if as organizers do, are really framing our lives in terms of safety, security, and thriving, and that us lawyers who are working on the social and economic tips, we have to think a hell of a lot more creatively about that, because there is no path in the traditional civil and political rights to be able to do it. And when we do that, it's like a rope-a-dope, right? So, and I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't be fighting for voting rights. Please don't, I want to say this clearly. I'm not saying that we shouldn't, but when you are in the South, or not even in the South, but the crazy human is running, and they're going to talk about, they're going to take away all these things, and you don't have access to this, you don't have rights to that, and we're like, we cannot let this person get elected. We then get into civil and political rights. What are our rights? What has Congress said? What is the state doing? And we as lawyers are only fighting that battle when the real issue is safety and security. So what would it look like if we actually just switched the whole thing up, and that lawyers, so rather than in a lot of traditional ways, organizers having to think creatively about how to fit their shit into what the law is going to make work? What if lawyers thought creatively about how to make that stuff fit where organizers are moving forward? Which I would love to have that conversation. I don't have the answer to it.
Marbre, please.
This is perhaps skipping ahead or a bit off topic, but I think to that point, and this to me just, I've been thinking a lot about abolitionist democracy, which for folks who don't know is a concept first coined by Du Bois and then later taken up, and I think further explored by Angela Davis, which essentially is talking about like what actually types of abolition would have been required in the post-Civil War era for Black folks and free folks to actually be free. And Du Bois, of course, says like it's every institution in this country. It is the Supreme Court. It is the Senate. It's the Electoral College. It is the state. Like every single institution has been built to preserve the unfreedom of Black folks, and I think by extension you could say Indigenous folks, and so they must be undone. We can't now just say like, oh, we're free, go ahead, be free. We have to actually rethink our economic systems, our social systems, our cultural systems, and I think we're in a moment of really, I think, having to reckon with the failure of not just the kind of post-slavery moment, but also the women's rights movement and the civil rights movement, that we actually did not undo institutions that kept us unfree. We tweaked them to create space for some people to be free inside of them. And the failures of that are, I think, haunting us now. And so I think it is a moment to ask, what is the remaking? What's the transformation of institutions required for our children, for our grandchildren, for those who come after us to actually experience freedom? And I think that part of what Vince is saying is about our Constitution, that our Constitution is also a conservative document. It was created in the aftermath of the French Revolution, and it was meant to preserve the wealth of rich white men in this country at the expense of poor, working class, brown, Black people, women, Indigenous people, Black people. And so that although it makes some political guarantees, it absolutely leaves untouched all the things that those of us on the left, even like liberals, you don't even have to go like that far to the left to think about the things that we believe should be basic rights are not in our Constitution. And so I think the fact we have a Supreme Court and a lot of judges across the country who have been put in seats because of a 30-year attempt and conspiracy to stack the benches, that believe deeply in like the word of the Constitution as being the ceiling for what we should be guaranteed, should remind us of the need to remake those documents and remake these institutions. And so to Vince's point, he's right. None of that's guaranteed to us by law. And so what do we have to do to actually, like, if we are seeking transformation, what is the 50-year plan to guarantee and create institutions that then are built to protect those rights as opposed to protect the capital and the wealth and the privilege of some over others?
Yeah, Vince, I love where we've taken this conversation, both of you. And Vince, I think that if I'm imagining some of my organizing comrades, having been a movement lawyer myself, they're probably looking at the screen and be like, we've been telling y'all this forever. Shift to frame of reference, right? And I think it is to your point earlier, there's a level of nuance here that organizers and lawyers who are in movements have to be able to carry, right? To kind of figure these things out. For those that are, know that this momentum is going to be sucking us in both into both the election cycles, rightfully so, and then also into this like conversation around like fixing the Supreme Court. People have talked about expanding the size of the court, or impeachment of Supreme Court justices, or what have you. What do you think about the value of those, given what both of you have said about like the way in which the structure of the Constitution and our constitutional democracy, in quotes, is and what it's meant to protect? What do you think about how organizers and movements should be looking at those kinds of conversations, right? Is it something we remove ourselves from? Is this something worthwhile there? I'm just curious because, it is something that dominates the headlines. It is something that the more progressive flank of the Democratic Party will take up, as a particular talking point. And sometimes it feels a little bit like shooting, just shooting crabs in a barrel or something. It's just people are just shooting at something, but there's not necessarily a clear strategy. And so I'm curious what you think about those solutions, how we should contextualize them.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, for the organizers that have been like, we've been trying to tell you all this for a long time. Yeah, we heard you and we hear you. And also part of our challenge, Marbre and mine and some of our comrades, is that we also need to organize the legal field. So it's not that like we're not hearing you and and we think you're wrong. It's just like we got a whole sector to kind of move. So number one. Number two, to answer your question, Thomas, I'm Team Marbre on this. And what I mean by that is when I think about the work that I've done around jails and prisons, and I think about the work that I've done and CCR's done around stop and frisk and police policies, one of the things that I'm really heightened to now these days is the extent to which I want to expend energy trying to fix a broken system that if I fix it, it just actually works more efficiently to mess us up. And so there was a lot of discussion recently about the question about abolish the Supreme Court, what that actually means. And so when I say that I'm Team Marbre, I am not in a position to say that we should add more people or we should have we should have a stronger vetting process, or we should be impeaching folks, or we should have term limits, or all that kind of stuff, because we're just theoretically creating on-ramps for more people to come in to keep the system going. So I really want to, Marbre is someone that I think thinks that I think holds this question in ways better than me, and I'm still trying to figure out how to do it. So I wanted to kick it to you, Mar, to see kind of how you're thinking about things.
I love it because I'm going to punt it to somebody else. I'll say, since I finished law school, my career has been around working with movement groups to create demands. And that process has always been like a process of deep study and consensus building and conversation. And I haven't had these conversations yet. So I don't know, like, to be 100% to Vince's point, like I think the spaces that I'm in is still reckoning with the immediate aftermath of some of these and thinking about triage. And I think is planning on having deeper conversations about what is the demand. And I think what I will say, and this is a longstanding, I think, conundrum inside of abolitionist spaces, whether it's abolitionists of the PIC or abolitionists of abolitionist democracy spaces, is how do we balance between mitigation of harm and transformation? That it is absolutely true that when you see Vox and like I think the New York Times, no, it wasn't the New York Times, someone else had a whole article about court packing, and I was like, when our neoliberal friends are talking about court packing, that it is an attempt to say the legitimacy of an institution that is not legitimate. And we should be very, very wary. And I think, as Vince mentioned, and as you said, if you walk through what is at stake in the next 3 or 4 years, in the short term, there's a real conversation around how do we stop a bleeding wound right now. And so I have seen demands from organizations who we've supported and who we trust around things that diminish the power of the court, things like forced retirements, expansion of the court, jurisdiction stripping. But I don't think anyone I've spoken to thinks that those are the solutions to the problems that we face. I think everyone is really clear. And I think, I think a lot about kind of disaster capitalism and shock doctrine of like these moments provide openings on both sides. to actually create more space for radical agendas. And if we concede too much, if we like compromise too much, or we try to like mitigate in a way that legitimizes, we in some ways just re-entrench what is for even longer. And so we create a longer term chronic wound. And so I don't have an answer. I think I'm really waiting for different movement groups who I'm in relationship with to figure out and to help them figure out and to support them in that, like what is the long-term demand. But I think what I'm clear about is that the question we're balancing is like, what are steps to mitigate the harm that's been done, but also the potential harm of this court, and not just this court, other courts too, with how do we really seek transformation? How do we talk about how undemocratic and unaccountable not just this group of 9 people is, but this institution is? How do we have the conversation that Vince just surfaced around the kinds of rights we actually think should be guaranteed and the structures that have to be created to guarantee them, right? And so I think that it's really important that whatever demands we're making or supporting, whether it be as individuals, as movements, as organizations, we have our eye on the prize, which is that packing this court would not solve this problem. Like guaranteed, we'll have it again. And we'll go in a tit for tat for that. So I think us being really clear about like, does this short-term solution in the wards of folks from this organization and critical resistance, like does this move us towards an abolitionist horizon? Does this get us closer? And we should apply those same stringent types of litmus tests to whatever reforms we're proposing for the court.
Yeah, if I could just jump in,
Yeah,
you actually you lit it up for me, Marbre. Like Marbre, as you were saying earlier, is that the Supreme Court doesn't have any enforcement power, which is one of those weird features. The other feature that you also pointed out is that we've got no enforcement power against the Supreme Court. And that's the battle that we're having right now. And I think that as I'm thinking about it and hearing you, Marbre, I'm thinking about the democracy, that the push should be to create a more democratic and accountable court system, including the Supreme Court, and it is neither right now. And I would also point out that, any organizer will tell you that when we're winning on the ground politically, then the right wing starts talking about term limits. And when they're winning on the ground politically, then the liberals start talking about term limits. And so the term limit question, the impeachment question, and all of that kind of stuff is about accountability, and it is about democracy, but those are the mechanisms that we go to that are maybe short-term solutions that will come back and bite us in the ass. More Supreme Court justices is, as Jay-Z might say, more Supreme Court justices, more problems in the end. I think that's actually probably true. Maybe Jay-Z wouldn't say that, but but I would say, I'm just throwing this out as a provocation, that we are facing the right just did something that we have been talking about for 100 years on the left. They just did it. They took over the Supreme Court. They're about to take over Congress. That every time that somebody is a right center conservative in the primary elections, they call them a socialist. And they're winning the whole thing. And that in the context of democracy, honestly, relatively few of us are radicals and progressive in our vision for the country. So if we put the whole thing to an honestly electoral college democratic vote right now about which way should we be going and what should be our rights, we would lose. We would lose, I think, at this particular moment. And what we're actually trying to do is build power so that if that magical thing ever happened, we could say with real confidence that we are all down with the change and the transformation that wants to happen. But the question is, should we start with the court? Is the court the biggest problem that we have right now? It's a big one and it's a disaster, but I'm not sure that's the place we start.
I appreciate all of that, and I appreciate all of your time today. I got one more question for both of you in the spirit of CPE. Part of our work is about study, as you mentioned, Marbre, grounding our movements in historical knowledge, and strong theory and rigorous analysis. And so, Marbre, you mentioned Du Bois, you mentioned abolition democracy. Vince, you talked about sort of changing the frame of this conversation into talking about the rights that keep us safe, right? And I'm wondering what you reach for, what book, what kind of study might be something that would guide you in a moment like this to understand the context. And what might you suggest for some of the folks who are listening in today as some material that can help them sort of reframe the conversation and rethink this moment?
I've been really interested in history of resistance recently. And so I mentioned and have been thinking a lot about, especially the pre-Civil War era. That was the last time, well, not the last time, but I think it's a really powerful example of when like every institution in the US was stacked in a way that was meant to maintain the unfreedom of Black folks, and there was a war. But I think before the war, there was a lot of political jockeying, there was a lot of mutual aid projects, there was a lot of resistance projects, there were lawyers who've been planning for decades around Dred Scott and other cases. And in the same way, I think it was in the AO in lots of ways, that there was this understanding of like, oh, this is like, these issues are coming down, what are we doing to be prepared? I also have been super interested and always am in kind of the Reconstruction era and the especially educational strategies that were undertaken. But I'll say lastly, I think the historical era that I'm also like in this moment holding, I think, is around the Lochner era, and specifically also though around the influenza in 1919, the race riots where like white mobs attacked Black communities across the country that followed. You see also the onslaught of a lot of unions forming during that time, that I think like thinking about other times in history when we've been kind of at these precipices of possibility, and how folks have organized themselves to resist and to build power, as Vince said, and to change public opinion. That like when you think about what people thought of as guaranteed rights or what people needed in 1915 versus 1930, it was vastly different, and it was because of the decade of organizing. So I'm really interested kind of in those time periods. I also will say that I think having a political home right now is more important than ever. And so that is both about like what you learn there, but I also think it's about being in community with folks who are doing mutual aid and movement work, and being part, like figuring out like how your legal skills fit in to their agenda and their program. And so wherever you are, there's a group, and if there isn't, you can start one, who's thinking about how they're resisting and withstanding. They're going to need those networks and that backbone. So those are two places that I'm getting inspiration and history.
Thanks, Marbre. Vince.
Yeah, and I would say that the era of history that I'm interested in now is, I think, also the Reconstruction era. I'm the cat that's been reading Philip Foner's Reconstruction for the last 30 years. I'm still not done with it. But I'm struck by, when I go back, of these moments of clarity around what things could look like. So for example, there when the government came in and kicked white people off the islands off of South Carolina in order for Black folks to be able to live there, it did and would constitute a constitutional crisis if it were to happen now. But I'm really interested, not so much the politics, but what are the mechanisms by which that was something that actually could happen. It feels like it would be impossible for our time, but it has to be possible. And I think things like that have to be possible in order for us to be able to realize the freedom that we're all striving for, and that we've been told that we are moving towards. And the other era that I'm interested in is late 50s, early 60s, pre-civil rights laws. So before the 1964 Civil Rights Act, before the 1965 Voting Rights Act. One of the things that I'm feeling is that we had broad, and it was a complicated movement, we had broad movement activity that manifests itself in those two key laws. And it feels to me like we lost a lot of the momentum around organizing by moving to those laws that we wrested some compromise from were going to save us. And now, of course, here we are 60 years later, fighting tooth and nails for those same laws. And it feels to me that that moment right before we got the quote unquote win is the place that feels to me a little bit like we are. And it feels like that's a place that we should reconnect to. And then finally, I've been thinking about, in the context of our work in international work, our work in Palestine, and in the work in the United States, looking at litigation that was happening during apartheid in South Africa. So clearly, whatever happened in South Africa was not because of the litigation, but there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of lawsuits around unjust laws that everybody lost. It wasn't even, it wasn't even a question. And I'm really curious that in that moment, what would it look like, and what's the role of the lawyer, even when you know you're going to take on the dead loser? And it might actually be helping to lift up the voices of the people that are challenging this for the historical record. That may be important. So that's kind of where my head's at right now.
Vincent, Marbre, thank you both. I really enjoyed having this conversation with both of you. I feel really lucky because I feel like this is probably the best thing I've heard analyzing some of the decisions at that macro level. There's a lot of good discussions about each of the different cases, and I think it is obviously worthwhile to do the individual treatments of each of these cases and where they're heading. But I think it is just as important, if not more important, to understand the power of the people in these moments. That there's a lot that we can do and should be doing, and contextualizing this in history and understanding where we are in the historical struggle is essential in a moment like this.